My mom never forgot the judge's eloquence, and I don't think you will. He said, you know, your native country, Canada, is like your parents. Your new country, the United States of America, is like your spouse. When you marry, you don't stop caring about your parents. So should it be with your country. Always honor in your own way your native country, yet being true and devoted to the United States of America. Is that lovely?
Wow, that is stunning.
I just love it. So, if you've ever written a book for publication, once it leaves your desk, that's when, geez, I wish I would have told them about my Congressional Medal of Honor. I wish I would have told them this. I wish I would have told them that. But there's one worse thing than that. I wish I had not said that, and that happened to me. It involved my dad and the way he described one of my brothers, his son. For many in my dad's generation and in that culture, work is physical. You work in the mills, you shovel, you weld. Activities like reading and research, that ain't work. It's just not work. So it was their 60th wedding anniversary, and we had celebrated that day, and we all had kind of sobered up. No. I sat them down, and I interviewed them. It's in the book. And, you know, they were so great. There was never a hesitation. You know, my mom was 83 at that time. You know, what time did school start? 8:20, you know. Name your brothers and sisters. She had 9. But when mentioning one of my brothers, my dad described him as one preferring books to say real work. Literally what he said was, he was not as ambitious as the others. I know what he meant. My brother's proclivity included little physical work. It was books and research and intellectual pursuits. He was hardly a lazy lad. He eventually became dean of the law school at Notre Dame. Okay.
Wow.
So to even things out, let me say that in reality, no one was ever prouder of a son than he was of my brother. But I should have voiced that differently in the book. Next book. So, never been accused of humility, but I am so happy about the buzz around these communities in Maine and New Hampshire about the book. Sometimes I think I get better reviews than if I had written the Iliad. Because growing up Franco-American is a lot about all of us. Every man, every woman. I share with you the pride that we have in our Maine communities. And if this little book of 161 pages has eclipsed some of the negative stories we read or hear today, then we have shown a bright light on the goodness and integrity of how we are, how we really are in our core. And I rejoice in its success. So, may I read to you? Come over there. This one has a bookmark. Thank you. This won't be long, I promise. Not at all a political statement, but rather an efficient delineation, usually stated in French. All non-Francos were called by us Americans. C'est un Américain. That means he might have been Polish, he might have been Czech, but that's the way we spoke. We continued to call ourselves Canadians until sometime gradually evolved the appellation French. I do not consider myself French. You know, if a Mexican person had been here 100 years, like I almost have been, and says I'm Mexican, that offends me. I'm not French. I am of French extraction. I am a Franco-American. Aware that we children would quickly learn English when we interacted with the outside, our parents required always and ever that we speak French in the house. Although this edict felt like capital punishment at the time, especially since I did not learn to speak English until I entered the first grade, today, as I said before, I can gratefully claim that my English and French have enriched my life and have facilitated travel all over the world. As I consider my life at home as a child, I conclude it was a rather typical Franco upbringing. Were we poor? I don't know. If so, we didn't know it. Enough to eat? Absolutely. And my mother was a master chef at transforming, combining random leftovers into delicious entrees and enhanced by sauces, spices, and the like. We were required by our parents to eat evenly. That means each portion evenly. You couldn't like eat all your potatoes or eat all your vegetables. You had to eat evenly. True to most Franco families, then breakfast, which was called déjeuner, contrary to petit larousse, as close to, was consumed immediately upon arising. Lunch we called dîner, like dinner, dîner, as close to noon sharp as possible, depending on schedules, and supper was souper at a punctual 5:30 after my dad would come home from work or us from school. And well do I remember my dad's usual breakfast: juice, eggs, thin slices of salt pork spread on toast. Hearty meals carried over from his youth and his days on my grandfather's farm. Especially during the Depression, on Sundays, my mom would cook a piece of meat, beef or pork favored, for our main meal, which was usually eaten at noon. Complemented by potatoes and veggies, my mom magically reintroduced each meal's remnant meat as a different species every dîner until Thursday. And of course, you know what Friday meant.
Fish.
And what did Saturday mean?
Beans.
Right. Whatever was left in the refrigerator was artistically transferred to a baking dish, strategically covered with pie crust, you know, the trellis stuff, baked at 350 degrees until done. Observing meatless Fridays was infinitely more appealing to me, usually mackerel, haddock, or salmon with whipped potatoes and a couple of vegetables, than Saturday night with beans and franks. Saturday fare. It seemed that we were served tons of vegetables, including onions, a lot of onions. And I can see why. It's not an expensive vegetable. It adds so much flavor to dishes. I remember promising myself as a child that I would someday grow a watermelon garden. Souper, too, was a hearty meal that might be further categorized as a meeting. That's when my parents discussed their day and inquired about ours. The previous sentence is code for "What did you learn in school today?" You know that. These were not always festive Aussie and Harriet meals. Although my mom sometimes catered to some of our finicky-ism, a favorite line of hers when we put up our nose at some plain or table dish was, "If it's good enough for your father who earns it, it's good enough for you." You've all heard these. As I wrote above, pork roast was a favorite. Sandwiches with pork butt meat saturated with delicious homemade ketchup were assembled between thick white bread slices the night before, kept in the fridge until we fetched them the next morning for school or work, exposed to room temperature all morning, lacking any kill dates. They were consumed with gusto at lunch and no one ever died. I told you about our menus. Pork pies started at Thanksgiving. That's when you break open the first pork pie. Hash, du hachis, which is diced potato, leftover meat, of course, onions in a brown sauce to use up leftovers. Crepes, everybody knows that. Salt pork, the grillade de lard, often sliced or diced and used as a butter substitute. Croutons and boudin. By the way, my dad lived to be 90 and my mom to 94. Almost done. In short, this whole business of the culinary can be summed up with the adjective frugal. And waste, after all these years, is still not part of that vocabulary. I think some of you may have those remnant values. You do not waste, especially food. And according to our parents, it wasn't that there were children starving in China. The reasoning given here was that no matter if we had eaten boudin or hashi, God has thus given us our daily bread. Most of our clothing were products of a collaborative feat. My mom and I used to go to Salvation Army on Friday evenings and carefully select used garments that she would later launder or have cleaned. Then she would unstitch and press the material, and following this, my dad would gingerly trace a pattern, some home drawn, others either simplicity or McCall's, a prospective piece of apparel on that cloth, which my mom would later stitch together, and voila, a coat or a dress, including this one. Frugal. My dad used to remark that there were only 3 food items, here they are, that were required to outsource from the farm where he grew up, and it was tea, flour, and sugar. Likewise, when it came to clothing, in our own immediate family, the only purchased items were underwear, some stockings, and shoes. That's the end of my story.
Wow.
So, it was an idyllic childhood. I can never blame any of my problems or my mental health problem, whatever, on my parents. They were just wonderful. Like you, the values that were not just taught us, they were modeled. Having children was a commitment. And along with our teachers, you know, I always cite Sister Mary Adolph. I mean, there was no such thing. I like that word, Adolph. Do you have questions? No math? Yes.
Oh, gee, this brings up a lot of things. I'm not Franco, but my wife is.
Okay.
Yeah, she was born and raised in Lewiston, and name was Landry.
Oui.
And she learned French at home before she learned English. In fact, and then when she started in the 1st grade at Holy Family School,
Yep.
you know, her parents sort of converted to English at home. But she tells,
Thank you.
well, when she talks about her parents, they had a pretty rough upbringing. Her mother grew up in a kind of a tenement in downtown Lewiston. Her father grew up on Sabata Street. His father died when he was 2. They were very, very, very poor. And in fact, he had to drop out of high school. And something of a turning point came with World War II. And that is when he had 2 other brothers. And when World War II broke out, they all enlisted in the Army. And, you know, they grew up at a time when, you know, proficiency in French was seen as a disability. You know.
You're right.
Except that when he went into the Army, he never finished high school, but he was a bright guy. Took a series of tests. He was put into the Signal Corps, and then attached to the Army Air Corps. So he's getting sort of an elite group. And as I say, the French was sort of a disability until his unit went into Normandy the day after the invasion. Then all of a sudden, hey, Brad, or Sergeant Landry, you know, we need you to translate.
Yeah.
You know, for the local officials.
By the way, a very topical subject this evening.
Yeah.
2 more days.
And it was not only officers, you know, they fellow GIs would say, hey, Ray, French girls over there, help us. But there was one incident, I don't want to take up all his time. There was one incident.
Did he have any candy bars?
What?
Did he have any candy bars?
Anyway, he met up with his brother in Paris, and this is, you know, as the Allies were sweeping through. And he and his brother, and I think there was another guy who didn't speak French, you know, so they were speaking English. They went to a cafe, and so they were speaking English, and they, of course, in their uniforms, and there were these French civilians, and there was really one loudmouth who was talking about all the disruption and all the chaos that the Americans were causing. And you can imagine there's a lot of troops and trucks and so forth. And my father-in-law and his brother hearing this, understanding this, and getting really mad.
I can imagine.
And when they left the cafe, his brother went over and said in French, "Well, do you want the Germans back here?" So, the other thing is, you mentioned religion, but you know, in the early 1920s, you know, the Ku Klux Klan was very strong,
Oh, it is.
and
Yes.
their target were
French
Catholics, the French
Oh,
Canadians.
yes, definitely. That's a great story.
Yeah.
You remind me of when I went to Paris. I went to Paris with my brother. You hardly ever spend time with a sibling, you know, at a later age. And his wife, who was born, who's Irish, went with her sister to Ireland. But I was with my brother in Paris, and if we were, you know, on a subway, for lack of the real word, and I didn't want somebody to understand what I was saying, I would speak French.
Oh, wow.
Well,
Wow.
there was another thing. My oldest son and his family had a au pair from France, and she kind of raised the hackles of my wife because she told our grandchildren that Canadian French wasn't real French. She's no longer there.
Seems to me I heard that song before. Any questions? Yes.
Was anyone in your family forced to anglicize their names to get along in the culture?
No. Tell us about that. I know that some people did. Greenwood, Boivard became Greenwood.
Yeah.
But it happened to somebody.
In my family tree, that's in the 20s, some of them couldn't make a living in northern Maine. They were Lefebvre. And so they went to Hartford, and the only reason they could get a job down there is they had to change it to Bishop. And my grandmother's name was beautiful French, it was Euphemie.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And to get along with the English neighbors, she changed it to Phoebe. That's why I asked the question, if
Yeah.
that's typical or not typical in your experience as a Franco-American.
The related story I have is that in some public schools, if kids were speaking French in the schoolyard, they were punished.
Yeah.
Wasn't there a law to that effect up until 1969, something like that?
Something like that, yes. Yeah.
I grew up in Fall River,
Oh,
Massachusetts.
many Franco-Americans.
And when I moved up here, I could not swing my tongue around the way the people pronounce the names that everybody down in Massachusetts is anglicized. I mean, even the older people, they would just with their names and go on, and I came up here and I still can't swing it around to make it sound like it ought to.
I can understand that.
But that